and she whisked her grandson away. I have imbibed fairy tales ever since I was 6 years old, when I used to sneak into the public library and scatter several books on the floor to read, even if I couldn't read them. In addition, my mother used to read the Grimms and Anderson tales to me every night until I could read them to myself. When I was a grad student at Columbia University and traveled to Germany to learn German, I decided to compare German romantic tales with those written by American authors. My dissertation was titled The Romantic Hero in German and American Literature. And soon I realized there were unique fairy tales all over the globe that opened new and fantastic worlds for me. It was then that I became a scavenger of folk and fairy tales, hoping that I might understand why they were created and how they might help me to live in a brutal world. Fairy tales speak truth to power. They are spread all over the world like dandelions. We must be careful not to step on them, not to shred them. Old, uncanny fairy tale books are lonesome and maltreated. They are ignored because they are considered quaint, nice to look at briefly with children, of course, and with a touch of nostalgia. Yet deep down, we sense there is something more to the tales than our longing for the past. Old, uncanny fairy tale books should not sit on bookshelves and be allowed to become musty, nor should collectors and libraries hide them. The dazzling and unfathomable wonder tales want to breathe hope through words and images and daydreams can be realized. We can allow them to do this if we learn to think out of the box. Then we arrive. We arrive in alternative worlds where social justice dominates, not dictators. It is in the forest of alternative worlds that we are free to determine our own destinies. Many valuable and hopeful books of the past deserve to be rescued. They still speak to us, and in my work on fairy tales, I have discovered superb writers and artists who want to enlighten us so that we can come out of our dark days. They refuse to die. For example, Edouard Laboulaye was a feisty French politician who contributed to the founding of the Statue of Liberty. Charles Godfrey Leland celebrated the indigenous and incredible witches he met. Kurt Schwitters fled the Nazis because his paintings and performances challenged fascism. Bela Balach, too, was also a homeless wanderer who kept writing revolutionary plays and novels, while Christian Wehrmann sought to use his books and paintings to rescue his home. Ernst Bloch and Mariette Lidis discovered the art of daydreaming that showed the way to utopia. Herminia Zormulin believed in revolutions that would change the world for the better, as did the naive Lisa Tetzner. Felix Salten chose to use books about animals who were more human than humans. Emery Kellen withstood 2 world wars and came to America, where he wrote pacifist books. Johnny Rodari's pacifist and dazzling stories are still alive today in Italy and need to be spread all over the world. There may still be hundreds of books with enlightening tales that I hope to excavate and save from being disregarded. Instead, they deserve to be honored for resisting the dominance of stupidity in our country. Let me repeat, short takes. Let me give you some short takes on the writers and artists I just mentioned, for their works are now available in English, partially in the book that I published recently. Edouard Laboulaye, 1811 to 1831, was one of France's foremost jurists and politicians in the 19th century. He published highly unusual fairy tales. In fact, his production of stories and novels is stunning. They include Contes Bleus, Blue Tales of 1863, Nouveau Contes Bleus, Blue Tales in 1868, and Dernier Contes Bleus, Final Blue Tales in 1884, as well as experimental works of fiction. Very little is known about Laboulaye and his literary accomplishment, especially in America, even though he was a great admirer of American democracy. He supported the anti-slavery movement, wrote several books dealing with the history of America and American constitutional law, and played a key role in developing the plans for the Statue of Liberty. Hermine Soeur-Müller, 1883 to 1951, became the leading writer of revolutionary fairy tales for children in German-speaking countries during the Weimar Republic. Her tales dealt with a variety of themes, ranging from tyranny to the exploitation of the working class. And she experimented with the parable, allegory, and Oriental folktale. Because of her political activities, she was forced to leave Germany in 1933 when the Nazis came to power. A remarkably prolific writer, Soeur-Müller translated about 150 English works into German and wrote 30 novels and mysteries and story collections to earn her living, while keeping active in the anti-fascist movement. In 1938, she emigrated to England, where she spent the latter part of her life and published her last collection of fairy tales, Little Allies, Fairy and Folk Tales of 14 Nations, 1944, along with stories, essays, and novels. Charles Godfrey Leland, 1824 to 1903, the American Charles Godfrey Leland traveled all over the Western world to gather magical, otherworldly folk tales which he recorded and published. He believed in magic and witches and was one of the first folklorists to publish tales told by Native Americans and European gypsies, not to mention Italian youths. Béla Balázs, 1884 to 1940, was a highly versatile Hungarian writer of poems, plays, and stories. After he participated in the failed Hungarian Revolution in 1919, he fled to Vienna, where he was hired at one point to write pseudo-Chinese stories to match Mariette Lidis's Asian paintings. In the 1920s, he moved to Berlin, where he wrote his own tales and collaborated with Lisa Tetzner to write a play about a boy who travels throughout the world on the back of a magic rabbit to learn about injustice and resistance to dictators. We could learn a thing or two about this rabbit. Mariette Lidis, 1882 to 1970, an Austrian Jew, left Vienna after World War I and became a celebrated experimental painter in France and later Argentina. Most of her paintings focus on people living in poverty, unconventional women and men, and the disastrous conflicts of our times. Paul Vaillant-Couturier, 1892 to 1937, was a Bohemian poet who fought in World War I for France, then rebelled against the French government, and became one of the founders of the Communist Party in France. His famous story for children, Johnny Breadless, reveals the horrors of war, but also the hope that they can be overcome. His novel formed the basis of Tetzner's and Balázs's play Hans Orient, a story about a trip around the world. Emery Kellen, 1896 to 1978, another Hungarian Jew, was a gifted caricaturist who worked for the League of Nations during the 1920s and 1930s. After he fled to America in 1938, he worked for the United Nations and wrote and illustrated unusual political tales for children. Similar to Burroughs, Quinn drew extraordinary animals and poked fun at bureaucratic politicians. Yet it was clear that he was a passionate critic of war and fascism in all his fictional works. Rolf Brandt, 1906 to 1986, one of my recent books of haunting and hilarious tales, German and Norse folk and fairy tales, is based on Rolf Brandt's two anthologies, Fairy Tales by the Brothers Grimm, 1943, and Why the Sea is Salt and Other Fairy Tales, 1946. Brandt changed many of the classical fairy tales, created over 40 unusual illustrations that shed new light on the original tales. His work challenges us to read fairy tales with a different perspective. His haunting and hilarious fairy tales is one of the most fascinating collections of unusual tales published during World War II, and Brandt's illustrations will leave readers spellbound. Kurt Schwitter's 1887 to 1948, long before the term fractured fairy tale came into use, Kurt Schwitter's had turned the fairy tale upside down and inside out. Little is known about his subversive work as a fairy tale writer, mainly because very few of the tales were published during his lifetime. And even now, there has still been very little attention paid to his innovations in this genre and how they are related to his other Metz projects and to the radical fairy tale work in Germany, especially during the 1920s. Roma Wilson, 1891 to 1931. At the same time she was writing stories and novels, Wilson surprisingly edited 3 collections of fairy tales from all parts of the world: Green Magic 1928, Silver Magic 1929, and Red Magic 1930. It may be surprising to learn that Wilson took time to edit these works. Yet, if one reads the subtitle to all 3 books, a collection of the world's best fairy tales from all countries, it is clear also from the dedication to children that Wilson was using the tales to create a better understanding among the young, not only in the United Kingdom, but also in other countries. Maurice Drouin, 1980 to 2009, a famous writer of historical novels, turned to children in his delightful fairy tale novel, Tistu, the Boy with the Green Thumbs of Peace, and showed how they could upset the conservative world order. During World War II, Drouin has been a member of the French resistance and sought to bring about a more democratic France and Europe. His unique environmental novel is one of the first to encourage young readers to protect the environment from destruction. Gianni Rodari, 1920 to 1980, peace was also a key theme in the Italian Rodari's writing. A teacher until he took part in the resistance to Mussolini and Hitler, he joined the Communist Party and became a political journalist. At the end of World War II, he turned toward writing for children with the hope that he might help them change the world. Considered the most important writer in the world, that is in Italy, not the world, maybe Italy is the world, considered the most important writer for children in the 20th century, his philosophical and comical tales, novels, and poetry are colorful and inspire young and old to think outside the box. Now, there is one commonality among all these writers and artists. They put their lives on the line to change the world and make it more humane. Laboulaye opposed the totalitarian French government. Leland died in Italy while supporting the living ways of the underclasses Schwitters fled the Nazis and landed in Great Britain, where he continued to oppose fascism. Bela Balach fled the Nazis and landed in the Soviet Union, where he continued to defend communism, though criticized and imprisoned by so-called Russian communists. Marriott Lidis fled the Nazis and traveled to live in Brazil. Herminia Zermühlen sought refuge from the Nazis in Great Britain, where she continued to write anti-fascist works. Emery Cullen fought for pacifism in 2 world wars and landed in New York to write and illustrate books for children. Ernst Bloch, the outspoken and pugnacious philosopher of hope, fled the Nazis in 1933 and wrote his 3-volume book about hope in the Harvard University Library. Lisa Tetzner and her husband fled Germany during World War II for Switzerland, where they kept creating books for children. Gianni Rodari joined the resistance against Mussolini as a journalist and eventually became the greatest writer for children in Italy after World War II. Rolf Brandt landed in London in 1933, where he worked with the underground resistance groups to save Jews from the Nazis. Paul Vaillant-Couturier worked within the Communist Party after World War I, only to have his life shortened by an assassin in 1937. Roma Wilson moved from England to Italy in the 1920s and wrote about the devastating effects of World War I, only to die at the age, unfortunately, of 31 from cancer. Dorothy Burroughs, a critic of war, who wrote and illustrated extraordinary animal tales for children during the 1930s and 1940s. Maurice Drouin worked for the French resistance during World War II and became one of the foremost writers of historical novels after World War II. Excuse me for a second. Felix Salten. 1869 to 1945, was an Austrian-Hungarian Jew who became one of the foremost prolific journalists and writers of his times in Austria and Germany. He is best known or unknown for his novel Bambi, a story about the killing of animals that anticipated the killing of European Jews. Mm-hmm. He published numerous other animal stories and works of fantasy after fleeing the Nazis in 1938. Among all the known but unknown writers and artists of the first half of the 20th century, he was perhaps the most unfortunate because he never grasped fully the contradictions in his own life and the signs that were to diminish his contributions to Austrian and German culture. Born in Pest, Hungary, and then moved to Vienna with his family, he decided not to continue studying at a university in Austria because of the anti-Semitism he experienced all over. Mm-hmm. He changed his name from Siegmund Salzmann to Felix Salten, educated himself in all sorts of ways, though he became one of the foremost Austrian journalists and writers of plays and stories in the 20th century, and though he never denied his Jewish heritage, his great goal in life was to become more Austrian than all the Austrian aristocrats he admired. Mind you, these people are far right. However, in 1938, when he was compelled to learn that he was born to be killed like all the animals he wrote about, he fled to Switzerland, perplexed that he might be sent to a concentration camp. All he was allowed to do in anti-Semitic Switzerland was to write animal stories and non-political novels. One of his major stories, written in despair, is called How War Came to Zurich, and it was first published, believe it or not, in New York, in Esquire, in 1939. This novel is similar to Bambi because it reflects the sad situation that his and our world are enduring. I'd like, if you don't mind, read it to you. It's short, and then I'll be open for questions. And I think I need some more water before I drown out. Are you strong? Great. That's perfect. Thank you very much. Oops.
Yeah.
No problem. Okay, the story, as I said, was published in America in 1938, and it's called How War Came to Zurich. The bomb fell from the air. One might have said that it fell from heaven, but in the heavens, such frightful artifices are entirely alien. The most serious visitation of heaven is lightning, and lightning, which strikes mostly in the water or in the open fields, doesn't worry anybody. Houses have for a long time been efficiently protected against it. So it happens only very seldom that the heavenly fire causes a conflagration or kills anyone. Yet the bomb that zoomed down on the solitary Polish farm annihilated everything. It was an ordinary bomb, of medium size. It slipped accidentally out of the airplane, which was rushing through the air high above. Nevertheless, the farm which it hit was razed to the ground. The clay walls crumbled. The stretched floor roof, the wretched straw roof began to burn with a small, hardly visible flame. Inside, the peasant, his wife, their 5 children, the cow, and the work-ridden little horse were all killed. They were put out of their misery very quickly. They had no time to be frightened or to wonder. Just then, the peasant had asked, "Where's our dog? Where's Zurich?" He received no answer, only the thunderous explosion of the bomb. Then came death, and life died before it. Zurich was prowling around outside in the fields. He was catching grasshoppers. He caught a mouse. He ran after a quail and got quite annoyed because the bird flew away from him. But this was how he had escaped death. Not even the smallest bomb fragment reached him. The sudden explosion dazed Zurich for a second, but he didn't let that bother him. The pressure of the air flattened him to the earth so that he turned a somersault, but he was on his feet again quickly and found the experience rather exhilarating. He didn't guess yet what had happened. There were no people around because the wretched farm stood alone on the plain and very far from the nearest village. As soon as he gathered himself together, Zurich began to run with anxiety in his heart. Whenever he was knocked over, it was usually a routine kick by his master. He attributed every power to his master, worshipped him, and accepted with a mixture of terror and awe the blows that this almighty being let fall upon him. Zurich was a well-meaning dog, clever, like all the mongrels of his kind. He had all sorts of fathers and forefathers, mothers and foremothers, and from them he had inherited many of their peculiarities. He was neither big nor small. His coat coat was of no definite color, and because of his unkempt appearance, he made a thick, rugged impression. But actually, he had brown, speaking eyes, and his fawning nature, with his impetuous charm, won him the approval of his master, of his mistress, and especially the children whom he loved. Toward strangers, he always behaved with suspicion. He was a watchful guard, exceptionally brave, lusting for attack, and very hard to hush. At one word from his master, or from anyone in his family, Zorik's ears stood up immediately. They were enormous, wing-like ears, similar to those of a wolfhound or a Siberian Spitz. At such moments, ears and eyes waited with obedience. What do you command? I'm ready. Now Zorik decided to go home. His conscience was heavy with some grave awaited punishment. Twice he ran over the rubble, which a few hours before had been his home. Twice he wandered around the plain and searched in bewilderment. Finally, among the ruins, he caught sight of the hearth bench under which he had lain so often. He recognized the smoke-blackened thing, sniffed at it, sat down in front of it, and kept on wondering. The house was there where he had left, and now it was no longer there. Could this be a punishment? Crouching on his belly, he crept closer. The sharp smell of escaping gas struck his nostrils. He shrank back and sneezed. Patiently, he lay there, full of hope. He expected his master to appear at any second. His mistress and the children would come, and everything would be all right again. Yet nobody came, nothing stirred. Hour upon hour passed slowly. A short wail escaped from his throat, an imploding sound which said, "This is enough." About 2 hours later, he emitted a cry of anguish. "Do not leave me alone so long." Silence. Hours later, the yearning animal gathered his energy again, crept up to the ruins, sniffed and sniffing, struck his snout into every nook and cranny. There he came upon the scent of the children. Distinctly, he sensed the trusted smell, and there, his master, seemingly near, yet beyond reach. Zorik began to scrape and scratch the earth. Then it dawned upon him. They're dead. They're all dead. A beam came loose and fell down, missing him only by a hair. The dog leapt aside, frightened. He must have been doing the forbidden thing. He trembled for a while. Then he sat down, raised his head to heaven, and burst forth in a howl of sorrow. Long drawn tones of wailing alternated with touching whimpers. Yet no one was touched because no one heard the lonely animal. If Zorik had understood what had happened, he might have been a great deal quieter, but perhaps he would have been even more desperate. However, he had no idea of the events which had taken place during his absence, and found himself only near the catastrophic results that were driving him to the edge of frenzy. Night descended. Zorik felt his loneliness even more painfully. He whined and whined until sleep enveloped him. As morning began to dawn, he awoke and felt the pangs of hunger. The first sensation which came to him was mourning for the dead ones. So he waited and wailed and moaned and whined. But the further the day advanced, the keener hunger gnawed at Zorik. It was eating into his bowels. It constricted his stomach. It strangled him and finally entirely blotted out his morning. So it is with animals, and even with men and women. One can hear in his soul the bitter sorrow for the dead, yet hunger will compel him to set his grief aside and worry only about his physical welfare. Gradually, Zorik began to search in the fields. As he ran, he ate grass, snapped at the grasshoppers, beetles, and butterflies. Suddenly, he found himself facing a cat, which must have been hunting for mice. The dog growled at him threateningly and flashed his teeth. The cat, a powerful creature, quickly wheeled around and took to flight. The dog dashed after him. He wanted to kill him. He wanted to satiate his hunger. There was not a tree in sight. There was no possibility for the cat to escape. Zorg would catch him. Then they would fight. Growling, spitting, the two animals stood facing each other. The cat humped his back high and waited. The dog, saliva dripping from his mouth, attacked covetously and full of rage. Then a blow of the swift paws hit him right in the face. The dagger-pointed claws tore a burning wound right in the forehead. Zorg leapt back abruptly, let out a howl of pain, and fell with blood running down his face. Yet he returned to the combat so much the fiercer. In vain, now the cat sat up and struck out with both paws. The blows just missed Zorg's eyes, but from the double wound, the blood burst forth and blinded him. He crouched low, bewildered by hot pain. He thought no longer of attack. The cat strolled away without haste. It slunk into the grass and disappeared. It was not just a dog, and now he lay there, wretched, covered with blood and whining with pain. His house was destroyed, his people dead, and he found himself racked with pangs of hunger. He was seized with a wild spirit of revolt. He snapped about him angrily. Then he heard the steps of a man. Zorg's ears sprang high. He saw a man standing in front of the burned homestead, a man who resembled Zorg's master, a man who might be Zorg's new master, a man who would give him food, who would defend him. The dog raised himself wearily and ran giddily to the stranger. He wagged his crooked tail so eagerly that it bent against his flank. The stranger waved at him threateningly with his arms. Away! Go away, he yelled. Since Zorg remained there, imploring not to be chased away, the man stooped down quickly and picked up a rock from the ground. But before he could throw it, the dog fled with his tail under his belly. Panting, he sought refuge in the grass. He had the inborn fear that which all dogs have of this motion. Dazed, he staggered around. He picked up something green with his teeth. Then he decided to stretch out on the ground. Just then, he caught sight of the cat again. But the cat took no interest in him. It continued its mice hunting quietly while Zorg slunk anxiously away. He stepped out into the open plain. Once more, his heart began to swell with yearning hope. Meanwhile, a group of soldiers marching along, about 20 men heavily armed. On their backs, they had knapsacks containing all sorts of provisions and also weapons. Zorg breathed in the smell rapturously. He looked at the men. They were real masters, real defenders. Trustingly, he ran to them and began wagging his tail enthusiastically for them, dancing around the group. He knew nothing about war. He couldn't distinguish between friendly and enemy troops. The soldiers were standing around the wretched remains of what had once been the peasant farm. One of them laughed. That's what I call a good work. The others said nothing. The dog danced as if enchanted. The man who had laughed aimed his pistol at Zorg and fired. Zorg collapsed, struggled a little, and then stretched out. "Why did you do that?" asked one of the soldiers, disgusted. "Because it was a mad dog," the man answered. A third soldier spoke, irritated. "It wasn't a mad dog, it was wagging its tail. A mad dog doesn't wag its tail." "So what?" The man shrugged his shoulders. "What of it? It was only a Polish dog." In silence, the soldiers set out to continue their patrol. They felt disgusted with themselves. So, thank you. We have time for a few questions, and so just raise your hand and be glad to answer them. I want to, I forgot to mention that I love this bookstore. I live right nearby in the neighborhood, and I come here quite often, and I really am thankful for the work Majors and Quinn has done over the years, and it's amazing that they still let me in. Okay, any questions? Yes?
So in the promo, it said that you were going to talk about forthcoming books.
Yes.
So I'm not quite sure from the list of people you've read. Some of them I recognize as have already become books.
Yes.
Are others yet to come?
Yeah, yes, the working, yeah, let me say that, yeah, most of the books that I've wanted to do are out there, here in this bookstore somewhere, I don't know. But I am trying to work on a huge anthology of Jewish tales from the golden period from 1870 to 1933. It's going to be a huge book and probably the last book I ever write or publish. But I do have some books that are coming out that I did earlier this year or the year before, and they're coming out in this spring, but not by Princeton, by Rutledge. Yes?
Can you please remind us of the title of Maurice Druon's book for children?
Tistou, Tistou, the boy with the, I've changed the title, the boy with the fingers of peace.
And did you translate it? And
Yes, yeah, I've retranslated that book, and it should be here in the bookstore, if not, demand a discount when you buy yours.
I'll
Yes.
have to grab it.
Please tell me a little bit more about the fairy tales of
Of course
Are they
it is.
available in English?
Yes,
Or in
yes.
Tell please.
Yeah. I did the very first, when I began a series about 10 or 15 years ago called Oddly Modern Fairy Tales. And the very first volume, I think, was Schwitter's. And so you can actually buy it through Amazon or this bookstore. Will have copies.
As for my husband, he needs the math test.
Yes.
So I think I have that
You
actually.
have it?
But I'll look at my wife.
40th birthday present.
Yeah, well, it's a great series. It's not only tales that I've edited, but Philip Pullman, Marina Warner. There are a lot of these people are friends of mine, and I've dragged them in and gave them an ultimatum of some kind. So they've all agreed up to now. So actually, some really great tales have come out. Chinese tales that are really beautiful by Juan Zhang, Indian American or American Indian, Chinese, and he did a beautiful job of these Japanese tales, and also a collection of Italian tales by a young professor in Vermont, and I'm forgetting her name. And so as I speak, there are 3 more in modern fairy tales where maybe I've written a preface or something, but for the Mike Wilson is doing a French collection in England, and so on and so forth. So just be aware of what's coming out in that series.
Do we have anything coming out from Farsi? Ever it seemed like we needed, you know, of course, that Iranian fairy tales start,
Right.
there was always a time, there was never a time.
Right.
If there was ever a time we needed folk tales,
Yes.
it's certainly out of Iran. Do you know anything that's forthcoming either in Farsi or in English?
No, I don't, unfortunately.
I owe you an answer. I'll take it on myself. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, all the way back.
Question on the concept of how you define what is a fairy tale and what is not a fairy
Yes.
tale. Because when I heard you mentioning these animal stories, Orwell came to mind.
Right.
So, like, would you consider Animal Farm a fairy tale?
Not necessarily. You know, I really dislike getting into these definitions of the,
Yeah.
you know, true, genuine genre. So because all of these tales, even today, writers borrow from these other collections and change the forms and transform them and are experimental. So I don't think that there is I mean, there are some good definitions out there, some that I've tried to write,
Yeah.
but I think that we should be wary of them. The most important thing is that regarding fairy tales, because there are a group of stories that we can call fairy tales, literary fairy tales, or oral folk tales. I think that we can be generous and give the editor of the tales or the writer of the tales and so on credit, and not begin to question whether this is really a fairy tale. Yes, Rick.
I want to. Can you tell us more about Bella Balash?
Balash, yeah.
Balash, because this is how siloed I am. I only know him for what he wrote about film in the,
Yeah,
in the 1920s.
no, way before film. You know, when he was writing stories in the 1910s and 20s, film was not big. It was later on in his career that he turned to film. I think it was in Russia when he escaped, and he lived very cautiously. In Russia, he could have easily been killed because a lot of the Europeans who were communists and ran to Russia for help were killed, were murdered. So Balash was a very talented writer. He wrote stories for operas. He wrote poems. He wrote, he was multilingual, so he wrote in different languages. He's a very interesting writer in person, and it's a shame. There is a couple of large books in German that you can get a hold of. They're very good, but nobody has written a good biography of his works and so on. He was a very important writer. And in fact, if you may have noticed that he worked with Lisa Texner. He worked with I'm forgetting her name, the Austrian painter. So there was a lot of crisscrossing. These people knew each other. That's another commonality that I felt very interesting about all of these writers I brought together.
But there isn't much of his writing not much in English, you're saying?
Nothing. except the volume that I did. Yeah. Yes.
You know, a long time ago, I read Fairy Tales and the Art of Subversion.
Yes.
And I'm just, you know, when you're doing what you're doing now, do you, or how do you trace back to that? I don't know if that's an articulate question.
Yeah. You know, it took a long time for me to wake up in my life and realize that America was not the paradise or the utopia that people should have or had fled to. And I was not very political in my teens. And it wasn't until actually I went to Germany that I was really awakened by living there for about 5 years or so. I began reading philosophical works and so on and so forth. And it was at that point that I think I began to, let us say, I was influenced by the Frankfurt School. People like Adorno and some other very famous names that I'm forgetting right now. But they really challenged, Ernst Bloch a very important philosopher in my lifetime. And I began looking at literature and everything that I did practically from a critical point of view. And from that point of view, from a critical point of view, I also said, you know, there are other writers who are dead who may still have something to say to us, and it's a shame that we're not interested in these writers. And this happened particularly all over the world, but in Europe and in America. In the 1960s, nobody read Karl Marx up until at the university, or even Freud. I mean, the universities in America were so arch conservative when I grew up that nobody bothered to find out about these dead people who, whether it was fiction or nonfiction, really still mattered. And so I was shocked and really angry, you know, because I felt not only was I stupid, but I was stupefied, you know. And so most of my career, once I began discovering the Frankfurt School, changed immensely. Any other? Yes.
I know a lot of your work has been around fairy tales as subversive
Yes.
art, and I'm curious. I know that there are a lot of young people who are getting into, you know, they're reading all kinds of different things. Do you have either works of yours or other people that you think teens would be particularly interested in that might speak to them and what we're dealing with today?
I'd have to send you about a 20-page list.
I would welcome it. Yeah.
But I'd be glad to, if you get my email message, I'd be glad to send you, you know, a list of my personal books that I think people should definitely read, no matter what. Like Ernst Bloch, one of the great philosophers, and his books are translated into English. It's very complicated. But once you get to learn his style and how he plays with words and things like that, you can, you know, appreciate his work. But none of these authors that I mentioned are taught at universities. None. Okay, on that note, let's have some wine and talk and so on. Thank you very much.